Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Metro Atlanta chapter of the American Meteorological Society and National Weather Association's virtual webinar series. My name is Sid King, and I'm the current president of our chapter for 2020. And it's my distinct honor to introduce our first ever virtual presentation. I'm excited to look at the participation right now, and we have a lot of people in here right now, so that's really exciting. Our lineup for our first round of presentations this summer is still taking shape. We have 6 speakers lined up for this round, but our plan is to continue to keep everyone updated on the times and all the topics as all these talks become finalized. Today, our guest speaker is Nikki Hathaway. Nikki's a good friend of mine from grad school and is now a flight director with the NOAA Hurricane Hunters after working for 3 years as a meteorologist at the National Weather Service in Houston. She's going to be giving a presentation today on hurricane hunter operations and what their job entails. Of course, if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to drop them in our chat and we'll address them after everything is completed. And with that said, we will go ahead and hand it over to Nikki.
Thank you so much, Sid. I'm extremely excited to be here today. My name is Nikki Hathaway. Like Sid said, I am a flight director or a meteorologist with the NOAA unit of the NOAA Hurricane Hunters. So you might hear of 2 hurricane hunting units. There's the Air Force and there's the NOAA side. So I'm with the NOAA side. We're located in Lakeland, Florida. Lakeland Linder International Airport is our airport that we deploy from on most cases. And I just wanted to start things off with my first storm I ever flew into as an intern, actually, way back in the day when I was an undergraduate student at Florida State University. I saw we have some fellow Noles on here already on the participation list, so I have to do the signature chop, go Noles. And I actually flew into a hurricane, like I said, as an intern. And so this was Hurricane Arthur back in 2014. Crazy experience. Never thought I'd get to do this for a living, you know, all those years later, but here I am living the dream. This was one of my first flights, actually, when working as an Aspen operator. We'll talk a little bit about what that means in a little bit. And these are the 2 types of aircraft that I fly on, the G4 jet and the P3. And with that, we'll just move right along here. See if I can figure out how to advance my slides. Let me go back. I think it might have kicked me out. There we go. Awesome. So essentially, we are a team of meteorologists, right? So we have a lot of NOAA meteorologists out there, some that might even be in this call this afternoon, and some work in the National Weather Service, some work in the National Hurricane Center, but essentially we're all just one big team. So how my job plays a role into essentially getting the people the forecast that they need is we are out there collecting the data. So we are the data collectors, whether that be flying through hurricanes or during other times of the year when it's not hurricane season, still we're out there collecting data for different scientific missions we'll talk about in a little bit. So we collect the data and that data goes into the computer models that then the National Hurricane Center is looking at the output of. So they look at the output of those computer models, put the forecast together on the large scale, and then it gets passed down to the hands of the National Weather Service. And so you guys are in the Atlanta area, being the Atlanta AMS chapter, NWA chapter. So you would be following your National Weather Service office in Atlanta. And so they're going to take that information from the National Hurricane Center, localize it, bring down the local impacts to the public and their partners. And that's kind of the full circle. So what do we use to essentially track weather and predict hurricanes, essentially? So a lot of these things are probably going to be very familiar, right? Surface observations, whether it be a CocoRaw site, maybe a couple of you guys own those or have your own CocoRaw site set up. ASOS sites, those surface observations would be one example of the actual data that's going into some of our computer models. Things like upper air soundings, weather balloons. You know, I know the Atlanta office actually launches these. Not every weather service office does. But upper air soundings, that vertical profile as the balloon moves up, collecting pressure, temperature. Bear with me with my slides. Sometimes they have a mind of their own. But yeah, so tons of different types of upper air observations go into those computer models. Satellite, radar data, all things that the typical meteorologists and really a lot of the public are familiar with. But we also have hurricane reconnaissance, or aircraft that are essentially flying through the storms. And the reason why we're needed is because satellite can only do so much, right? And so where there's not radar, where there's not surface observations, are usually where our hurricanes or tropical systems like to form, in the Atlantic and the Caribbean. We don't have floating radars, you know, we don't have a buoy out there to capture all the data all across the oceans. So we use satellite from that large scale perspective to get an idea of what essentially is going on out there, but you do need some more specialized data, and that's where we come in. We're collecting the things that are determining, how strong are the storms? What are the highest wind speeds in a specific tropical cyclone? Where are they? And what's happening right now before it makes landfall. So we're out there collecting the data that we don't really have a platform to collect at this time. That's where we do our job. That's where we make our money, is getting that data. So essentially, we're just going to dive right in, talk about what I do on a daily basis, what I do when I'm not flying. And it's not just the flight directors that are making this whole thing go round. We have lots of different occupations that work together in this hangar to make our mission a success. So we currently have a fleet of 9 aircraft. The 3 that I mentioned, the 2 P3s and the 1 G4 jet, those are our heavy aircraft, and the rest of them are our light aircraft. And we will eventually have 11. We have 2 on the way. And so this is just kind of an inside scoop as to what our hangar looks like. Our offices are up kind of off to the side. You can't see those here. This is what our actual hangar floor looks like when all of our aircraft are piled in there. And there's actually a team of 110 individuals working in this hangar on a daily basis usually. Obviously, given COVID, things are a little bit different right now. A lot of us are teleworking, getting our job done from home currently, but 110 people it takes to keep this thing afloat and keep the mission at the forefront, and a successful one at that. So we have people like pilots, the flight directors, which is what I am, or a meteorologist, flight engineers. We have flight mechanics, mechanics that are working on our aircraft around the clock. They're awesome. And our support staff, our administrative staff as well. And we essentially have to be able to fly 24/7 every single day of the year, just like the National Weather Service works around the clock. Very similar in that regards. So that's essentially the lowdown. And now we're going to zoom in to the G4 jet and talk a little bit about that. So this is the platform I've actually been flying on the most. This is kind of a funny thing. A lot of people like this. Our aircraft, especially the heavy aircrafts, are named after the Muppets. So this is Gonzo, Gonzo the G4 jet. And he flies well above the system. He's not the one that's going straight through the storm. He's flying around 40,000 to 45,000 feet, and he goes super fast, just below the speed of sound, actually. It's pretty cool when you're sitting on the plane and you can see the Mach it's flying at, and it's pretty impressive to think, wow, I'm going right below the speed of sound right now. Not everyone can say they do that for, their offices on a ship that's moving that fast. So it has 2 different types of radar systems on board. The nose radar is going to be what we're actually looking at when we're guiding through a storm environment. And then we also have the TDR, or tail radar on the back here, that is also scanning the systems that we're flying over and around. And that information is going to be used more for a research type purpose, while the nose radar is what we're actually looking at to guide our way around these types of systems. So it's going around the storm. I keep saying around. This is not the one that's going through. It's really surveying the overall storm environment. So when you have a tropical cyclone, you're thinking about how the steering flow might be, you need to know how strong that ridge might be, or the trough that's lingering behind the system and if it's going to pull it. So you want to get those sampling of those types of environments surrounding the actual system itself. So that's what this plane is mainly doing, and it's dropping a ton of dropsondes. So depending on the mission, there'll be a certain number of dropsondes that are released from the aircraft, and a dropsonde is essentially the opposite of a weather balloon. So it's falling from the aircraft vertically down to the surface. And so this is what my office looks like. So essentially I could be sitting on the right-hand side or the left-hand side, depending on what my colleague, my other flight director, wants to do. So the right-hand side is actually the flight director seat. That's going to be the one who's the main communicator on the board, on the aircraft, making sure that everybody's on the same plane, has the same mission, essentially on the plane. And so they're talking to the pilots in the front, they're talking to the flight engineers in the back, making sure they know when they need to release the next dropsonde, giving the countdown, things like that. And while the person on the left is actually processing the dropsondes that the flight engineers are releasing on the back of the plane. So that's pretty cool. All the data is being quality controlled real time before being pushed off the aircraft and eventually into the computer models. So these are the 2 desks that I would be sitting at. And you also will notice it's actually a lot skinnier of a tube than what the P3 would look like. The P3 is going to be much larger. So the jet's small. You probably have 10-ish people on board as a max, while the P3 is going to be a larger aircraft with like 18 to 22 people. So we'll talk about the P3 in a little bit. So this is what it would look like if you were to look out the window. Essentially, you're really high up. You can see the clouds look fairly low compared to where we're flying. I'm just going to flip through a couple pictures here to give you kind of an inside scoop as to what you would see if you were looking outside the G4 jet. And so obviously we're transitioning from cumulus clouds to more of a cirrus like over deck, and then essentially if we were kind of embedded in that cirrus, what it would look like. So you can kind of see the difference in terms of views we could see out the window. And now the P3. So the P3 is the one that most people think of when they think of the Hurricane Hunters, because this is the one that's going straight through the eye of the storm. It's flying anywhere between 6,000 to 12,000 feet usually, and it's also releasing dropsondes, collecting flight level data, things like that. We do have two P3s, one being named Miss Piggy, the other one being named Kermit. Like I said, named after Muppets. And it's collecting a lot of that same data. So it has different types of radar on board, which we'll talk about here in a second. It's dropping those dropsondes. Essentially, it's a flying science laboratory. And it's much larger in size. So this was the P3 we were talking about. We were talking about what it would look like inside the pilot seat. So where they're sitting, what they'd be looking at in the cockpit. And then these images up in the top right are some of the types of radar we would be actually looking at as the flight directors also on the back of the plane. Or I shouldn't say back, but just behind the pilots. And then the lower fuselage is what I was mentioning. This is the radar that's below that you can see really well in this image here. We also have our nose and our tail, but the two front radars, the nose and the lower fuselage, are going to be the ones that we would be mostly using as flight directors to navigate through the storm. And then that picture that looks like a butterfly at the bottom, that's actually one of our flight patterns. So that's kind of what it would look like in terms of how the drops would be and the orientation of how the P3 would be flying essentially in and around the storm. As long as you're still with me, you should be seeing the look, the view outside of the cockpit. So essentially this would be, a rather benign environment before obviously entering the storm environment. And like I mentioned before, we do have lots of different types of people on board the actual P3. Besides just the flight engineers, the flight directors, you also have a navigator on board the P3, and you have the pilots too. And so this would be the inside look essentially of a hurricane. So this is Lane back in 2018 in the Pacific Basin. And you can see those stadium effect like people talk about, right? At least the meteorologists, the weather weenies out there know what I'm talking about. That stadium effect that you would see inside the eye and those blue skies up above. And this is another example. This is actually during Katrina back in 2005. Blue skies, once again, you can see definitely a little bit more of that stadium-like structure inside the eye here. Calm winds, rather peaceful, right? And then also, just another example, back in 1998, Georgia's, you can see that stadium again, just the thin layer of cumulus clouds at the bottom of the eye and the blue skies above. So we talked a little bit about Dropwindsondes before. I said it's the opposite of a weather balloon, right? Instead of it going up, we're dropping them from the aircraft and they're falling down vertically. And they're collecting things like temperature, pressure, dew point, moisture type values, wind, all these types of things, latitude and longitude. So we know exactly how it falls and it drifts, where it's at, and what type of values it's recording. And these are essential, especially when you're out there sampling the storm environment and really the environment surrounding it too, right? Not just the storm itself. So once it does fall from the aircraft, we cannot get it back. It does, cut off connection to the aircraft when it hits the water and it splashes. But we are actually able to see that vertical profile of data real time as it's falling from the aircraft down to the surface of the earth. So that's really cool. And then once that channel is cut and we're able to disconnect from the sonde, that's when that AVAP operator, which sits, or I'm sorry, the Aspen operator that sits on that left-hand side of the plane. I showed you the seat before, the one that one of the flight directors could be working in. That would be when they start processing the sonde and making sure they're going through and quality controlling the data before sending it off the aircraft. So depending on which aircraft is releasing which sondes, you're going to get a different amount of data, right? So the P3, which is flying at a much lower altitude, is going to be collecting a vertical profile just like the G4 jet, but the G4 jet's going to get a lot more data. The skew-T sounding is going to be a lot taller compared to what the P3 is collecting just based off the altitudes that it's flying around. So this kind of gives you an idea in terms of where we're dropping and how we're dropping. And so the P3 is really going to be focused on staying close to the storm. And these are kind of some of the examples of different types of radar that the P3 is collecting. So like I said, you have the nose radar. That's going to be the main thing we rely on to determine how we're going to be penetrating through any storms, going around, deviating around storms, and getting to the eye of the system. So that's kind of what it would look like. That red, yellow, and green, those are the types of colors we're seeing from the nose radar. And then that lower fuselage radar, that's going to be supporting what we're looking at on the nose radar. So the two images on the left-hand side are what we're looking at to make the decision of how we're going to be getting through the system. And then the data coming off the back of the plane from the TDR, the tail radar, that's going to be more of our operational or research-based radar. So that information can go straight into the computer models, and wouldn't be something we'd look at technically for navigating in and out of the system because it's on the back of the plane, right? So it's monitoring things behind it as we pass. So we're going to stay focused on the two in the front of the plane. So just to kind of give an example here, right? We have our satellite data, then we overlay it with the radar data just to get an inside scoop as to what's going on when we're preparing our flight briefing before taking off that day. And then we'd have our flight plan, and that would be our mission for the day. This is what we're going to do. We're going to try to stay true to this pattern. We're not going to try to deviate from it as much as we can unless we have to for a safety reason. But this is essentially what we're going to be doing. Is we're going to be preparing our flight briefing before going onto the plane, having another briefing plane side, making sure that the crew is all on the same page before taking off and eventually flying this type of pattern. And the patterns are going to vary depending on which aircraft we're on. So I talked about how the G4 is going to be flying around the storm, not going through it, while the P3 is the one that's making those butterfly or those figure 4 patterns actually through the eye of the storm. So I always think in this image that the G4 picture on the left-hand side there, it looks like a seahorse, which always makes me smile. I think that's kind of cool. But it's a perfect example of how it's so different from the P3. Why having a much larger range, and the fact that it can fly so fast allows us to really capture that environment much better than the heavier P3 would be able to. So people talk about drones. We work with UASs essentially too, and they're going to be the ones that are focusing and flying in the areas that essentially that we can't take the P3 through. So we'll deploy them from the aircraft, and they're another aspect of what we're doing at the Aircraft Operations Center. And so I talked about, how we're going to go a little bit into each of the roles of those type of individuals that work at AOC, because we are just really one big team. And so obviously the thing that's near and dear to my heart are going to be the flight directors, the meteorologists. This is where the category I fall under. And you can see we're either briefing, preparing the crew prior to flight, working up the dropsondes in the Aspen seat there, like my colleague Rich is doing, or Jack in this picture. I was at the Aspen seat and he was flight directing that time. And these are going to be the main things we're doing while we're actually preparing for a mission. And while we're actually working in the Aspen seat, working on the processing of the dropsondes, we're also keeping a drop log. So I have a picture there of what that kind of looks like. So you have to stay very organized, especially when you're deploying multiple expendables, because you will have multiple falling at one time. You can have 3 or 4 dropsondes in the air that you're waiting to process as they hit the ground. So you definitely want to be organized throughout the process. And then we have our pilots, right? They're the ones in the front of the plane. They're making sure we're getting to where we have to be. And then we are also going to be watching, I think I got stuck. Are you still there, Sid?
Yep, we're there.
I had something pop up saying upgrade.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. I just clicked off of that.
Okay, so keep going.
Yes, it's all good.
Okay, so we talked about the pilots, what that would look like in the front. And this is kind of the process of what it looks like when they're deploying a dropson in the back. And this is going to be our flight engineers and our technicians are going to be watching this and doing these type of duties. So I'll just play a quick video.
Yeah. Standing by.
So that's the overall process. Really quick, right? They're listening for that direction from the front, from the flight director of when they should be releasing that sonde. And then together they're working to make sure it goes out the tube, out of the bottom of the plane, and then we close that seal back up and stay pressurized and everything like that. So they are working together as a team in the back to deploy all of our dropsondes. And then that image in the bottom where you see the green, the blue, the pink, and the red profiles, that's the data coming in live and what we're looking at, not only in the flight director seat, but the AVAPS operator and also the flight engineers in the background monitoring. So we get this question a lot, so I figured I'd just throw it in here. We're almost done. What are we doing when it's not hurricane season? Well, we do a lot of things. Atmospheric chemistry, to snow surveys, to flood surveys, and actual winter storm missions. So like this previous winter, I was out flying atmospheric rivers located out of Portland, Oregon, and we were flying those things called atmospheric rivers or horizontal hurricanes that impact the west coast of the US. We had a crew over in Ireland working on the ocean storms mission. We had people down in Barbados also doing some convective storm research with a PI down there. So we're constantly doing different things. We have some of our smaller aircraft, our light aircraft actually monitoring and working on marine research. And so they'll be flying over and monitoring different types of calves and things out there with their PIs. And of course the drones, I talked about those a little bit. So we have tons of things going on when it's not hurricane season. And once again, I'm super sorry for the clunkiness of my technical difficulties today. And I'm sure you guys have some questions, so I want to make sure I leave some time for those. I think we're going to get back to those after we throw things back over to Sid. So I'm going to try to stop presenting my screen and send things back to Sid. All right, Sid, I think you should have the floor.
Yes, thank you so much, Nikki. Give me just a second. I'm going to pull up my slides once again. So let's give Nikki a round of virtual applause, not just for such a great presentation, but also for being our inaugural speaker and going through the experimentation process on how this was going to work. Once again, here's a list of our speakers for the series. Next Monday on June 22nd, Jared Rennie, a research meteorologist with the North Carolina Institute for Climate Studies, will be giving his presentation on Asheville, North Carolina, a climate city. We've hosted a variety of events over the years, all with the purpose of building a community of meteorologists and weather enthusiasts to collaborate and share their knowledge. So I'd like to take the opportunity to thank our officer team, Steve Gregg, Brad Rubin, and Sarah Tonks, for the diligent work that they've done in making this series a reality. That concludes today's presentation. Here's a list of all the ways that you can connect and follow with our chapter over various media. On behalf of the Metro Atlanta AMS and NWA, we'd like to thank you all for your attention. And we're now going to tackle some of the questions that were in the chat window. We've got a few minutes left here that we can address those questions. So let me open up the chat window and we can take it away. All right. Nikki, do you have, can you see the chat window?
Yes, I'm looking at it right here. Do you want me just to roll through them or?
Yeah, you can just roll through and then take a couple of the questions that are in here, and then we can follow up with some of the other ones that we can't get to after the presentation.
All right, sounds good. So I'll start with Archie. So are the drops essentially used to collect data points? And so dropsondes, yes, so they're going to be mostly a data point specific, very localized sampling of environmental parameters, right? It's not going to be as widespread the resolution like our flight level data would be, or even our radars on board the actual aircraft. So vertical profile, it's going to be falling. We're going to be getting data every half second to every quarter second, depending on which parameter you're looking at. It's very quick. We have a lot of data coming in at once. And obviously the actual dropsondes are going to be drifting as we fly away and as they enter that storm environment. So that's why the latitude and longitude is so important, to have a GPS on board the actual dropsonde itself, so we can see it as it's sometimes getting sucked into the eye or into the RMW, the radius and max winds, things like that. So it's very specific to that area that it's sampling. Yes, it's definitely a point compared to a very high resolution type of sampling.
Thank you.
And then Ari, oh.
I was gonna say thank you.
Oh yeah, no problem, good question. So for Ari's question, and I see Ari has two questions, so I'm gonna go ahead and answer those both, kind of one following another. What percentage of dropsondes are defective? Now that's gonna be very specific to each mission, right? So when we're out flying a mission, like for example, atmospheric rivers that I did this previous winter, for each flight, because I believe we flew, oh man, how many flights did we fly during that entire deployment? I would say anywhere between maybe 12 or 15. But the actual percent of defectiveness is going to be specific to that one flight. So that 1 8-hour flight. So some, we'd have 30 sondes expected to be launched and all 30 would be fine. And then other times you'd have one that maybe wasn't packaged the best way and it would either be a fast fall or you would lose your temperature or your humidity sensors. So similar to like a weather balloon where, you know, sometimes the actual radio sonde could just be defective. It's similar in that with the drop sonde. So I couldn't give you a specific percentage, but you know, sometimes you'll have 5 that are just kind of funky and it'll be either a fast fall and it's falling so fast, the parachute didn't open properly and it wasn't able to collect the data the way it's supposed to, or even just losing the actual instrumentation, like that little arm coming off and losing your temperature or your moisture values. So it's really specific to the mission, but the actual defectiveness, they're usually not really that defective. You might have a fluke 1 or 2 here and there, but a majority of them are going to be working just fine. And then summer internship programs. So right now we're not running anything moving into this summer, but in the past we definitely have. That's how I found out about the NOAA Hurricane Hunters when I was an undergraduate student. We actually had someone like me come in and talk to our AMS chapter when I was at Florida State, and that's when I learned about the internship program. So definitely keep your eye out because we will be bringing those back. This year we're just not doing anything, but I would definitely anticipate, I know the Hollings program that is put on. We've gotten a lot of Hollings students that have come to our office, and then we've even had just regular internships that are not through the Hollings program. So definitely check our website.
Thank you, Nikki.
Yeah, hey, thanks. Are there any required certifications, flight meteorological hurricane hunters that other don't require? So this is another good question. So I would say most of the individuals that are working as meteorologists or flight directors for the NOAA Hurricane Hunters, they do have their masters. So in terms of certifications, that's just something that a lot of us do have. But there's no extra courses or classes that you're having to take before being able to apply to the position. The job openings are posted on USA Jobs, just like the National Weather Service or the National Hurricane Center would post theirs. And it'll have the requirements specifically of what they're kind of looking for in that job description. But you know, I didn't have to take any specific certifications before applying. I just had my undergrad, my master's, and that's essentially all you really need to be able to apply. And then you're taught. Obviously, I'm fairly new. I just started last year, so I'm going through the entire training program now, making sure I'm qualified before flying alone as a sole flight director for both the G4 jet and the P3. So you're going to be doing a lot of on-the-job training if you were a new flight director in that type of role.